I'll share a presentation. So will that be okay?
Yes, yes. I will. You have been made co-host. And
Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Okay.
good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 34th session of the AIM Prime program. Today's session is on art and science of negotiation, and our speaker for today is Hasit Seth. Hasit works as a counsel in the Bombay High Court. His key focus is on arbitrations, civil and writ litigation. He has negotiated many deals, most of them involving technology and related services. He has formally studied negotiations at Harvard Law School's program on negotiation. Over past 20 years, Hasit has been a partner at a law firm, general counsel for a MNC, a startup founder, worked in US with 2 law firms doing patent litigation and prosecution. Hasit is a computer science graduate followed by LLB and LLM with a gold medal from Mumbai University. He later did a LLM in IP from University of New Hampshire in US. His interest areas include law, technology, deal negotiation, economics, and art. So with this brief introduction about Hasit, welcoming him and handing over the session to him.
Yeah. A very good evening to everyone who is joined in either through Zoom or via YouTube. So let me start up without much waiting with my presentation, which I'll share with you. Just one second. Where is it? Yeah. Just one second. I'm not seeing it here. Okay. I may have to log in again. Just wait 1 second. Yeah, it's here. Okay. I hope you can see my presentation screen. I'll turn it to slideshow.
Yeah, we can see it, Hasit.
Okay. All right. All right. All right. All right. So the talk is titled Negotiations, Art and Science. Let me tell you that the way to do these things actually is on a boundary between this art and science. I mean, art is a very big term and science is a very well-defined term. So it is somewhere in this zone of both these things. And I'll try and convey to you why this is so as such. So let me jump into it. So this is my background, which Mugdha has already introduced. But let me give you an example. So let's say your company is ABC Limited. It wants to buy 1000 kgs quantity of a material X from manufacturer XYZ Limited. Now XYZ agrees to supply 1000 kgs of material, but cannot supply all of it within 1 month. So it says that it can only supply say 1000 kgs over the next 6 months. But XYZ Limited says that if you pay 1000 extra per kg, it can arrange to supply the material within 1 month. Now ABC insists, which means your company insists it will only buy at an agreed price and wants supply within 1 month itself. So what happens next? So this is a very typical common supply chain scenario, which you will find in almost any business, I mean, which deals with products or services to some extent. Now, what happens in this scenario? One thing is both the parties can stick to the posture or position that they have taken, and no deal or no transaction, no agreement, no exchange, no economics can happen here if every side just sticks to it. Now, what if you don't want to stick to the positions? Then obviously you have to negotiate, and that means essentially there are two things. One is you have to give up the hard position that you have taken, or the position which is of maximalist benefit to you, that this is the maximum benefit I want. I want 1000 kgs of that material at a certain price at a certain time. So here what can be done so that the interests of both the sides are fulfilled to a maximum possible extent, yet like no side feels cheated or shortchanged or has made a loss. Now it's not possible that in every transaction there is a win-win situation and every party in every transaction makes like profit. But it's possible to do deals where you are in the zone of like broadly acceptable outcomes, and that's what negotiation seeks to achieve. It may not be the most optimized outcome, it may not be the most, so we are not talking operations research here where we optimize outcomes as such. You can theoretically do so, but practically it's very hard. And I'll tell you why. The reason is that human beings are involved in this process, and that's the reason. Just one thing, feel free to drop questions in the chat box and I'll happy to answer them along the way. The presentation is there, but I don't have it as like a roadmap for everything that I wanted to say or have in mind, I mean. So feel free to put any questions in the chat box so that we can like have a better discussion. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I have the chat box open with me. Feel free to ask questions. And Mugdha, may I request you that whenever like there is a significant question, or whenever I let you know that I'll be happy to answer questions, please just let me know if there are few collected questions.
Sure,
And I'm
I'll
watching it. I'm watching it. If something comes, say, which needs an urgent answer, we'll be happy to do so.
Sure, we'll do that.
Thank you, Mugdha. So this is a story which I have told a number of times, but happy telling again. This is the story of actually how Microsoft arose as a company, and the root of it is actually a failed negotiation. So before MS-DOS, which is Microsoft's DOS operating or disk operating system, came into picture and IBM PC popularized it, the most popular operating system on the market was CP/M, that is Control Program for Microprocessor, it was called. And on the right side, you will see an advertisement for it, and it ran on a number of different small microprocessors, 8080, Z80, and all those kind of things. And it sold for $100, with disk and documentation and other things, I mean, and it has its own assembler and all that. So if you are into computer science, you'll kind of like appreciate that all of these things together, it costed quite a bit. So it was the most popular operating system, And in this scenario, IBM decided to get into personal computers. The background is IBM used to make mainframes. I mean, this was a tectonic change for them to make personal computers. I mean, Apple was around, Atari was around, but IBM, a very big blue enterprise kind of company, getting into PC was a big thing. But they needed a ready operating system because operating system also brought in a lot of compatible apps which would run on it. We didn't used to call them apps that time, but it was programs which ran on it. I mean, and one of the key one was what started the use of personal computers in a big way was the VisiCalc, which was Dan Bricklin's spreadsheet. So the very first spreadsheet software, it ran on CP/M. So that was the idea. So IBM wanted a ready operating system. So the folklore has it that IBM and Kildall's team could not agree on a non-disclosure agreement. While Kildall was flying his hobby plane, I mean, he was an aviation enthusiast, but these teams could not agree on a simple non-disclosure agreement that what will you not disclose to third parties, and the whole deal fell through. And IBM's team from there went to Microsoft, which had something called, which they had brought it from somebody called QDOS, which was quick and dirty operating system. It was its nickname, internal nickname was, and IBM essentially decided to go with Microsoft, and that's what we get as. So it was Tim Patterson's QDOS. So Gates offered only a license to IBM for DOS and few compilers for $700,000. Gates was very young, as you would recall. Gates with Paul Allen, who had co-founded Microsoft. So this $700,000 license to IBM, and that too, it was a non-exclusive license. So essentially, I mean, Microsoft reserved for itself the right to license it to many other parties. And this was a masterstroke of negotiation because it led to IBM compatible PCs and, like the whole PC market that we see today. And till today, we see the dominance of Windows, which is a successor of DOS, and Microsoft in the personal computer scene for this reason alone. And it was due to a certain negotiation, a failed negotiation with Gary Kildall, CP/M, and a successful negotiation with Microsoft, and IBM's own need for a quick set of compilers, applications, and an operating system. So that's a story that, which created a whole industry, a negotiation story which created a whole industry by itself. I mean, uh, as such. So this was just to set the background of like what negotiations can lead to, and all big things have been done, like with sort of across the table negotiations with not all the parameters optimized, because nobody can see too far ahead as such how things would play out. uh, for example, nobody would have imagined, like 2 years of almost like very little business or economic activity during the COVID and COVID/Corona problems. I mean, so nobody can foresee everything, and that's why you have this black swan theory. Nicholas Taleb's book is there that you can try and forecast everything, but there are some events which happen way beyond anybody's imagination, and those are the ones which cause maximum destruction or change as such. So this was the outline I had in mind, that let's look at what are negotiations, why to negotiate, how to negotiate, entrepreneurial negotiations, and technology deals as such. Any questions until now, please put them in chat box. We'll be happy to answer them along the way. So what are negotiations? Let's look at those. Negotiations are a way to reach an agreement between parties. This is my definition. There are academic definitions around, and we'll see from both behavioral side of the things and more analytical side of the things. But this is what I personally feel, having done this over and over again, that they are a way to reach an agreement between parties by persuading each other and finding common ground for an agreement. So as a disputes lawyer, I can tell you that the unique thing about negotiations is that there is no third party involved. It's two parties negotiating with each other to come to an agreement. While in other scenarios like mediation or litigation or an arbitration, there is always a third party involved. In negotiations, the burden and responsibilities on the parties to persuade each other to find a common ground for an agreement. And it's a fascinating process, I mean, by which people kind of give up the original positions they've put across and come up with something which works from both of them. So somebody's asked me that how Microsoft reach a figure of 700,000. Uh, I I don't know the specifics of how they reached 700,000, but this was based on initial estimates which IBM provided of how many PCs that they are going to sell in the few initial years as such. So IBM's market reach was very big, but they were entering a new zone about which they didn't know much about the PC market. It was a runaway success is a different thing, but they did reach, that based on the numbers provided by IBM, because Microsoft had no visibility into how much of a success IBM's PC would be, and that's why they kept it non-exclusive as such. So I hope that clears it a bit. Uh, so that's like a working definition of what negotiations are. And where are they used? I mean, if you look around, there is massive number of negotiations happening around each, whether in personal settings like a family or even in work and business settings, I mean, around. So I have a list of them, and I'm sure some of these you can identify uh, whether you are in a job or you were in a job or you want to do a job or you are doing business or plan to do a business. Salary negotiations, sales negotiations. Sales is the most common form of negotiation that exists in business. Sales negotiations and tactics and other things are so common that people just call them sales. They don't call, or marketing, they don't call them negotiations as such, because it's so embedded in the process. Then you have investment negotiations, which are your VC term sheets and JV, joint venture negotiations between parties. You have co-owner negotiations when two, three, four people, whatever, a team comes together and decides on ownerships of the company and responsibilities. You have product roadmap negotiations within a team or within a company, even in large company. I used to work for Eaton, which is a large manufacturing company. There are several rounds of negotiation at several levels before an NPD, which is a new product development program, is decided that let's design and launch a new product. So it goes through number of negotiations between sales, manufacturing, design teams, engineering, and maintenance also. I mean, many other things like that as such. So you have those product roadmap negotiations, you have resource negotiations. If you need resources within an organization for a product, you need to collect, you need to negotiate with various people who can provide resources, whether they are finance, whether they are materials, whether they are people. All those kind of like resource negotiations are extremely common across businesses. Regulatory negotiations, so a lot of negotiations need to happen with regulators. So for example, to give you a common example, Elon Musk has launched Starlink, which is a set of thousands of low Earth orbit satellites by which is going to provide internet access to around the world. It's not purely satellite because it needs ground stations, but he has to negotiate a lot with regulators, and that's why it's launched in, I think, officially in 10-12 countries. But lots of negotiations with others are pending, with people, regulators, I mean. So, and you can see those things are extremely common, like Tesla has been negotiating with regulators in India for India entry and export obligations and investment obligations on the other side. So those are also like broadly regulatory negotiations. You have supply chain negotiations. So when there's a contractor and a subcontractor, continuous negotiations keep happening in terms of, although the contracts there are very standard. So there is some thinking that one negotiation is equal to one contract or in one agreement. So in supply chain, the contracts are pretty standard. It's the things which are a few numbers in the contracts as to the timing when it will be supplied and how much will be supplied and where it would be supplied and all those things that need to be negotiated each time with existing supplier. And with a new supplier, there are a host of more challenges, and there are non-disclosure agreements and others. Obviously, industrial labor negotiations, boardroom level negotiations about power, resources, fight, future of the companies, disputes, frauds happening in the company, all those things sort of happen in board level, and we get to know only when, like either newspapers report them or it gets into the business grapevine or the gossip circuit, that what did happen during the board level negotiations. Obviously, there are minutes. I mean, the company law requires the boards to present minutes to the ROC, but they don't cover everything, as everybody knows. I mean, so then there are crisis negotiations in businesses, societies. You have merger acquisition negotiations. You have business closure negotiations when you want to exit businesses. These are pretty tricky negotiation. I was involved with one startup which shut down, and they had to go through a lot of negotiations with their investors, employees, and many other people as such. All right. So what's the process of negotiation? It sounds like or looks like that few people are sitting in a room and, negotiating, but what actually are they doing? Are they just talking to each other? Is it just some kind of a more polite form of a chit chat happening around people? But actually, no. What happens is that proposals are put across by each side, usually sequentially, that one side proposes something and then the other side sort of uh, thinks over it and comes back either with an acceptance of that proposal or a counter proposal of their own. So this process keeps happening. The counter proposal is then evaluated by the side which proposed something in the beginning, and then the counter proposals are evaluated, and each side does it with their own team or with their own resources, considering their own priorities and not just what has been offered on the table. And one thing to remember is, what's not there on the slide is that there is massive information asymmetry in most negotiations. Very few negotiations we would see there is an FOTE kind of method of negotiations where everybody would put all the cards on the table which they know about. But in most negotiations, parties are not bound to put all that they know about everything involved with the negotiation with the other side. The commercial decency or honesty requires only to put across things, which fairness requires you, openness requires you to be conveyed to the other side. But obviously, whatever is your competitive advantage, let's say you are buying something from X and you are selling it to Y. Now, what are your advantages of costs that you are able to source products cheaply from X and making a profit by selling them to the Y? Because otherwise whole trading system would stop if everybody was like completely clear about what they are making and other things, profits and other things. So it's quite accepted in the business world that nobody will disclose everything except for what is required to be disclosed to the other side for a fair and equitable decision. So that information asymmetry exists in negotiations, and that keeps in a play, and hence it's necessary. So part of it, part of negotiating process is querying with the other side, that you ask right kind of questions, and certain answers which have to be given for those questions will be provided by the other side. But if you don't ask them, then those answers won't come through. And then each side tries to persuade the other to their viewpoint. Then areas of common agreement are found. Frequently, the positions taken, postures are changed. Concessions are given and taken, and concessions are one of the biggest part of negotiating process. And this is where the skill of good negotiators lie, that they are able to give concessions, but they don't significantly compromise their position by giving a concession. So that's the big concession. And one particular kind of negotiation, because we are dealing primarily with business negotiation, I've not mentioned it, are hostage negotiation. So FBI uh, uh, and SPG in India both have very specially trained people who are hostage negotiators, because you have situations where people are taken hostage and ransoms are demanded, or simply that will blow up things. I mean, so hostage negotiations are very, so there in those situations, giving and taking concession, giving concessions is a very hard process. I mean, the idea in those negotiations is to wear down the other side. Essentially, let the moment of intensity be washed away to, or be seen off. I mean, to see exactly where people stand and what kind of concessions can be realistically given and taken. But in most business negotiation, concessions are frequently given and taken after a reasonable deliberation. Positions are changed dynamically in response to proposals. So you can't stick to the original position you would have started. As we've seen in the supply chain position, if people don't change their initial positions, then no negotiation is possible. And all the while negotiations are happening between both the sides, what you have going on are essentially short term and long term implications of future agreement being evaluated by both the sides, because there's always short term implications are always there. Long term implications in majority of cases are bound to happen on the future of the company, product line, resources, something, I mean, as such. So why to negotiate? So one thing is, like what are alternatives to essentially negotiate. So there is no alternative to negotiations actually. That's why I named it TINA. That is a very common acronym. There is no alternative. Uh, because whatever alternatives exist are conflicts, confusion, and chaos as such. And that is not in interest of anybody. I mean, to negotiate that way. And refusal to negotiate, I mean, is a very common problem with people, that people just don't come to negotiating table. So a lot of situations I have been involved is, uh, particularly when some disputes have already happened, people refuse to come to negotiate because there are human factors like egos and all that. And it is very funny to, like even say this, but even corporations have ego. Although corporation is not a human being, it's a group of human beings, and it's only a legal or a juristic person in eyes of law. But corporations themselves also have egos, because not only individuals have ego, but even groups have ego. And negotiating with groups, and that is a very specialized kind of negotiations. But corporations being like in business, and because they exist for profits, I mean, it is possible to negotiate with them on economic lines. But there are non-economic negotiations with groups, and those are hard because there is non, like quantifiable factors which they need to be pacified. You have farmers negotiate, like conflicts going on. You have different environmental conflicts going on. So there is no money involved in those things. One side simply wants the other side to stop doing what they are doing. So those negotiations are not, like where you can put numbers across. But we have seen, like some things have worked out well, particularly say mining in Goa, for example, where the environmentalists gave a concession that some mines can be kept alive for the purpose that so many people are involved in the it's a source of employment for so many people. And also to reopen mines someday, or I mean, if it was possible to do them without environmental degradation. Coal mining, I'm speaking about coal, sorry, this iron ore mining in Goa. So there are like, I mean, these are negotiations where no money is on the table, but it's simply positions and sometimes egos and sometimes interests, I mean, or doctrinal positions as such. So those are there and those need to be negotiated. So there is no real alternative to negotiate except for, uh, to say that we'll stick where we are now. There is a term in negotiation field called BATNA. So, which is what is your best alternative to negotiated agreements, and that is essentially that what is the bottom line. I mean, that what is the level below which you will not go in any negotiation. Now, it's not, people don't tell you, like what is my best alternative negotiated settlement of a particular situation, but it's essentially to be discovered or assessed by the other side that below this point, I mean, or beyond this point, the other side will not agree to negotiate or give concessions or anything. Now, there is no school of thought or nobody is saying that you have to reach an agreement. That's why we have so many negotiations failing also. People cannot agree to some things. I mean, so you have to give up those negotiations and part on good terms so that you will have another day to negotiate, perhaps on the same topic or perhaps on a different topic with the same party. So these things happen. In the sense, refusal to negotiation is a common tactic, but with experience you can deal with such things, I mean, as such. Now, they are not, I call them approximate optimizations. Negotiations are not perfect optimizations by even miles, I mean, as such. So they are simply approximate optimization. You can approximately, come to something which is a very sensible outcome, and different people consider them as sensible outcomes, in the sense that, is it a short-term gain? Is it a mid-term gain? It's a long-term gain. Whatever you sought, from as your takeaway from the negotiation, if you have achieved that, then you could, say that approximately you got an optimized solution out of it. They lead to one good thing about the negotiation process is that they lead to very interesting new creative solutions which neither party had contemplated. So it's only when they got into negotiation that they realized that because other side suggested or jointly they came up with some solution or some idea which worked out for them, or it will work out for them to be in the zone of agreements. So in negotiation terms, it's called ZOPA or ZOPA, which is zone of possible agreements. People can only negotiate within the zone of possible agreements, because outlying outcomes, those are usually not sustainable. That it is a solution which one party just never expected, because it will not stick to it. They will come out of it. And as a lawyer, I can tell you, there is no perfect world. Even in the most developed countries, people break contracts, because although while entering contracts, they realize that everything will work out well, but it didn't work. I mean, whether from personal relations to commercial contracts. So people do break contracts, I mean. So, and then pay for it in terms of damages for breach of contract. But people will not sustain, or not keep up with a bargain if it is way beyond their capacity to bear, the agreement that they have undertaken. So that's something to keep in mind, that although you can come up with creative outcomes, but if it is way beyond the zone of possible agreement for even each party individually, then that's not going to sustain. That's a red flag right there. So I'll try and substantiate all this with some examples, but just want to tell you some background, because without it, it's not possible, only through examples, to how to, like, what we are talking about. So we negotiate without thinking about that we are negotiating. So there are lots of aimless negotiations happening which lead to non-optimized outcome, which distorted outcomes means losses, bad relationships. So once in a negotiations, a foreign party, an Indian party had told the foreigners, yes, we are very keen to do a joint venture. So the other party took it as a very positive signal, and they flew down to India with a team. And these guys said, are just we just conveyed that we are interested in a deal, not that we want to do a deal. But the other side already spent some money to fly down to India and all those things. And the Indian side said that we only thought that you are coming to meet us, not, that there was a deal on the table. So all days negotiations and all that was in a sense wasted. But that's how it happens. I mean, so it also, like, aimless negotiations lead to like bad relationships and unallocated losses. Can it be better? A lot of academic research backed by empirical studies exists to improve negotiations. Uh, but it requires a lot of ideas to be adopted, skills to learn, and lessons to apply. And these are, a lot of it is behavioral, in the sense like habit oriented. So has to be practiced. I mean, over and over in negotiations to be in the zone where you can deal with asymmetrical information asymmetry. You can deal with asymmetrical distribution of power, because very little times you'll find that both the sides have equal bargaining power. A typical startup struggling to get investments is hardly in a position to dictate any terms to an investor who has come up with a term sheet, that, or a VC who has said that this is what you'll sign. What are you going to do? You are going to take it, right? I mean, because your best alternative to negotiated agreement in such circumstances is to close the startup. So in those situations, so information asymmetry, imbalance of bargaining power, these are some things you can improve on them over time with some practice. I mean, and a lot of it involves with self-awareness and those kind of things, and assessment of human beings and those things. But in general, it's a practice skill. I mean, it's not like I mean, some people are good at it. I mean, naturally, but nobody is good at it all the time in all the circumstances. There are specific successes which people have had, and mostly data around those successes is anecdotal. It doesn't replicate very easily across all situations and all people and all times. I mean, so if you are keen, I mean, there is, so because science is mentioned in the talk, there is a lot of literature available about decision analysis. So decision analysis is a field which has been studied by the management and economic folks since a long time. I mean, that how do people make decisions? I mean, and can they be made better? I mean, as such. So there is an analytical approach to that decision analysis. Now, over time with experience, I can tell you that you can model negotiations, put, like, start with something simple like a decision tree with, weighted like tree nodes, that you put weights to different decisions or possible paths of the decision. But as soon as the rubber meets the road, you get on a negotiating table in a conference room with somebody. People other side, will come up with something which says that, your decision, like whole tree just didn't account for this. So although you tried to analytically model it and found out the most optimal outcomes, you really don't have the benefit of what other side's input would be. Now, if you were to, in a very cooperative situation, because a lot of negotiations are not adversarial, people are trying to cooperatively find some answer or a solution. So in those situations, you can jointly build something like a decision tree, which is the simplest, like analytical model for a negotiation, and say that these are the possible approaches and these are the possible outcomes that we can foresee today. And we could try one of these, and like this could be like the basis for our ultimate agreement between the parties. So decision analysis, yes, a lot of analytics can be done. And broadly, I mean, if you take the financial modeling included in decision analysis, then basic discounted cash flows, NPV calculation, internal rate of return calculations. These are essentially decision analytical models, expressed as numbers or in basic financial terms or basic statistical terms. You can have forecasts of all kind, market segmentation and market forecasts, etc. But a lot of those are magic numbers, particularly for early stage businesses or early stage products and services, which don't have a lot of past data. So we live with the kind of data we have. And so in decision analysis, analytical approaches do exist and a lot of them do make sense, but not all of them make sense all the time. The second category, so this comes from Howard Raifa's book, which is written with two other authors. The book's name is, I'll show you the cover page of it. It's called Decision Analysis, Negotiation Analysis. So which is tried to integrate, these 3-4 approaches. Then the second part is behavioral decision making. So behavioral decision making takes into account that how do human beings actually do so decision analysis is known as a prescriptive approach, in the sense it prescribes how decisions should be done or negotiation should be done, but behavioral decision making actually takes into account that how people actually make losses. So to give you an example, lots of mental models are popular, and I'm sure Kaushik Gala has talked or will talk about mental models. So one of all of them sort of play around with what are cognitive biases. So one of the great cognitive biases which everybody knows about or can relate to is that we overestimate the negative and underestimate the positive. So because of contrast, so negative outcomes get magnified at a huge scale, more than what the impact they've made, and positive outcomes don't make those kind of impacts. So behavioral decision making is affected by all these cognitive biases which human beings bring, either as an individual alone or as like a group of people, which is a company, or simply multiple investors talking to you or something like that. So one thing in terms of analytical or sort of normative analysis of negotiation Raifa uses is game theory. Now, game theory, there are strong proponents of it and strong opponents of it. Opponents in the sense they find some of these things to be impractical in negotiations. So it models small gaming situations or negotiation situations, and there are lots of available well-recognized games which have been theoretically established that you can predict certain outcomes, optimized outcomes. So game theory is all about optimized outcomes, but it presumes that there are rational individuals making separate but interactive decisions. And the big thing about game theory is that decision of other people affects your decision or whatever your outcome is. So take simple game like Ludo or like snakes and ladders. So it's not just what are your like the throws of the dice that you get will decide the outcome. It is the outcome will be also decided by the throws of dice which the other parties gets and the moves that they make. So game theory is there, a very interesting proposition analysis, and these get used as bits and pieces, in the overall negotiation preparation. But it can't be that there is some perfect game for a single negotiation. No negotiation is that simplistic that a single game theory or a game model can predict it. And negotiation analysis is Raifa's pet theme in the book, and that's about how to make collaborative decisions. So what he says is that all of these are in a sense adversarial decision making, but is collaborative decision making possible? And local like municipal decisions, where to put up a park, or environmental decisions, a lot of things which multiple stakeholders are required to analyze and come at an outcome which would be acceptable to those multiple stakeholders. So there you have a lot of collaborative decision making. So here you don't expect very smart individuals, but you essentially, expect reasonable individuals making collaborative decisions. So somebody's asked that, Vaibhav Bhatia has asked that any comments on behavioral decision bias specific for extroverted, introverted person or gender based, if anything. The gender based tropes are false. I mean, there is nothing like, uh, mm, you know, literature doesn't exist that, that there is any specific advantage or disadvantage to gender, like the gender of the negotiating person. But extroverted introverted person is a behavioral trait, I mean, of the negotiator, and it works well in some people in some way. So Henry Kissinger was Nixon's main, negotiator for crises all around the world, and his personality is of a certain kind, where, uh, he's extroverted in written word, but not so extroverted. I mean, in one-to-one negotiations, it seems. But he's been quite a bit of a success. So in diplomatic world, we see, like people with stiff upper lip but doing very well in negotiations. So the kind of negotiations, the situations, the best of negotiators, international diplomatic negotiators have worked on the Middle Eastern problem, peacemaking negotiations between Israel and Palestine. But yet the outcomes have not been great. And there have been, like all kinds of negotiators with all kinds of behavioral traits. So behavioral traits are not make or break of negotiations. But what do you do with those behavioral traits in terms of how do you use them in a negotiation that works? So a lot of times you feel that the person across the table is holding the cards too tight to themselves. They're not telling us, which way they are thinking or which way they want the solution to, what would be the shape of this possible solution to their eyes. You do come across those situations, and part of it could be behavioral. I mean, may not be, that they don't want to tell, but it's just they're not nature not to open cards. I mean, uh, with some self-awareness you learn these things, but ultimately it's, what's the outcome of whatever people bring to the table as themselves, their own behavioral patterns, and also the issue at hand, what is to be negotiated. So that's how it plays out. I mean, but they are not make and break, I can tell you that, because as hard negotiators who are there for outcomes, nobody is really paying attention to whether you are an introverted person, extroverted person, or of male gender or female gender or anything. People hard nosed business negotiations, nobody cares. And they are very good negotiators across genders, across ages, across cultures. And there is a large school of thought and discussion and literature available about cross-cultural negotiations. Because if you are negotiating with people in Arab countries, certain cultural norms apply. You are negotiating with Russians, Israelis, they bring their own, these are not personality traits, but cultural traits, national traits, and those have to be accounted for. I mean, if you want business to happen across the countries, I mean, as such. And a lot of negotiations, appear during the process to be going nowhere, that it doesn't seem that anything is going to happen as an outcome. But what happens is each side, minus the posturing or what is said on the table, is continuously evaluating their positions, and that makes the analytical approach very difficult to model. I mean, that it's so dynamic and changing, it's very hard to model. But yes, I mean, it's possible to have multiple kind of models for it and play around with it or tweak the models with some very good analytical skills, I mean, or data crunching skills. But that's not the end of it. That's all I wanted to say. So classical approach to negotiations is about human behavior. Transactional, the characteristics of it, it's transactional, it's behavioral, it's human centric, and depends on exchanges. Because human beings do get moved with exchanges. We like are a very bargaining society in a sense, as a like human beings have existed with exchanges all the time, and language to culture to everything has essentially developed due to exchanges. So human behavior tends to be classical approach to negotiation tends to be very human centric and depend on exchanges, and hence the need for concessions. In the concessions, the timing is a critical factor. If you give early concessions, then the other side reads it as you are desperate to like strike a deal. So a lot of time negotiators just wait for some time before coming to giving of any concessions. It's a lot of study period that we are still trying to understand, we're still trying to process this, and then like give like some concession or wait for other side to concede first. I mean, so all these things keep happening, very dynamic, but none of that is conclusive. And sometimes, as I said, it feels that nothing is happening. We are simply exchanging emails and doing meetings, but no deal is in the sight. But there is always a deal on the horizon, and that's why people are talking to each other. Otherwise, they would have stopped talking very early. As such, the advantages for this classical approach to negotiation is they are more resilient with change. They stick around for a long time because it's human beings who will sustain it, and those have been accounted for. I mean, as such. So those factors are the ones in it, and complexity is accounted for in human human centric negotiations, because human beings are doing it, and much more than any algorithm or analytical model, we can as humans can deal with far more complexity, which includes emotions, which includes fears, and those behavioral aspects, I mean, and biases, I mean, than any model that can come up with. But if the deal involves a lot of numbers, it involves a lot of uh, uh, quantifiable aspects, then obviously models and financial models like are the ones which account for the PE multiple in the VC world, that or the investment world is so dominant for buying and selling companies, is for this reason, that you have share price, and share price incorporates a lot of things. The current value of a stock and future potential for a stock, that essentially deals are done on PE multiples. I mean, so it's possible. So Harish Chandrasekhar has asked, could you talk specifically about information asymmetry in fundraise for startup? The startup team has more info about the business, product traction, and investors know about what IRR, quantum of investment, timeline, etc. they're looking to make. What do the two sides need to keep in mind during a fundraise negotiation? A lot of fundraising negotiations are based on, as the VCs would tell you, that they bet on the team, they bet on the people, and not the particular idea that they are running with. That said, VC investing is a lot of animal pack mentality, that they hunt in packs. I mean, just like wolves or tigers or whatever it may be. So they do, like, for example, like edtech is the flavor of the season. So they do, uh, consider not just the team, but also what's the flavor of the season. And they are all looking to flip their investments in 3 years, or some of whatever is their funds, horizon, investment cycle that they are into. So they are like looking for those aspects also. Now, the startup team may know more about business, products, and traction from their experience trying to market the product and other things. And the investors do know about their experience in terms of like having done these things process over and over again, and what sticks in the market easily, what kind of ideas are picked up in the market easily, particularly for B2C kind of investments, and what do not, is just based on the experience. But here, a lot of it is flying in the night. I mean, some of the variables are picked up from experience, and some are simply assumptions. I mean, magic numbers as such. So those are the information asymmetry exists, but there is not just between the parties, the asymmetry is not between parties, but the unknown is the market and the consumer. So, for example, when Google was launched, there were already 12 search engines. So, Alta Vista and others, I mean, like Lycos and others. So, I'm sure, if what the investors, some of the investors may have told Google that, why do we need one more search engine? There are already 12 of them, then they are doing very well. So, what is your this thing? But people who invested in Google early on, whether it was Ram Sriram or Andy Bechtolsheim of Sun Microsystems, uh, they just cut checks, thinking it sounds like a great idea and there is room for the overall market to expand. So despite there being information asymmetry between for both the sides about the other sides, goals, I mean, the third biggest contributor to that whole unknown situation is the market itself. That how will the market play out is something very few people understand. So today, all those 12 search engines are dead. Google is still alive and it's growing and thriving and it's in a very dominant position. So that's how the unknown there also was, that how will the market play out? Nobody knew. And how Google would capitalize on AdSense, its advertising platform, and others won't be able to do it. And Google would buy others who were doing something like that and have a large position in the market is something nobody could have predicted. So there are these two like modes, of conducting negotiations, and each of them has a value. If you are in a very collaborative situation, then you have like full open and truthful exchanges, or you have partial open and truthful exchanges. So idea is to be open and truthful all the time, but you essentially provide only information what is necessary. So even in organizations, it's on a need to know basis. Not everybody needs to know what is everything that is happening in the organizations. Now you have Slack based organizations and everybody knows what's happening everywhere around, flat organization, all that. But still, certain things are kept confidential in organizations and are limited to certain people. In the same way, in negotiations, not everything needs to be disclosed unless you are in a extremely collaborative situation. So for example, you have two potential joint venture partners who are trying to buy another business. I mean, so there between among yourselves, between two partners, obviously it should be full open and truthful exchange, so that the target that you are buying, you both as joint venture partners are on the same page. But in a slightly adversarial or non-aligned interest kind of negotiations, let's say one person wants to sell the company and one person other side wants to buy it, obviously, there's not going to be a complete full open and truthful exchange, because it would be on whatever you ask, I'm ready to answer as such. But other than that, I have no obligation to tell you anything and everything I know about what you're buying. After all, you are buying with your own due diligence, after all. No due diligence would be required if every transaction had complete full 200% open and truthful exchanges. That's why due diligence exists, I mean, in deals or in buying companies. Range of tools are available. A lot of them are like very shallow literature exists, how to be a hard knuckle negotiator kind of thing, or how not to give anything to the other side, etc. kind of thing. Some are very sophisticated with all the analytical tools or thinking behind it, but there is nothing like which merges everything into like a one set of toolbox which can be used in every situation. It just is not possible. I mean, yet to see anything of that kind. People have frameworks, people have ideas, people have systems which you could use, apply in right circumstances, but there's no one this thing, and hence it's not really a science in a sense, but it remains a very experience based empirical science, where things are tried, tested out, and best methods are adopted over time, because there is no theoretically perfect solution to any and everything that needs to be found out. So lots of literature exists. The last one is the Howard Dreyfus book, which I had mentioned, about negotiation analysis. I mean, and getting to yes is the one I'll talk about. which is more on the behavioral side of the things, but it's like common sense behavioral side of the things, and hence seems to be widely applicable and used by everybody, because it's very hard to disagree with what Roger Fisher and Urey are saying. I mean, so we'll consider that one in a little more depth. But if you want to have an analytical flavor of the things, then I would suggest Raifa's book is the one you need to refer to. Harvard has its own, like winning negotiations books, and all kinds of literature exists. The Kremlin School of Negotiation. I don't know what Kremlin School of Negotiation does. I mean, with KGB kind of tactics or what. I mean, but it does exist. I mean, as such. And never split the difference. The title of the book is actually is a very human, tendency to cut things in the middle that leads to 50-50, whether it's losses or profits, let's share them equally. That equal sharing seems to be like the most fair, reasonable thing to do in many circumstances, but it may not be so. I mean, because sometimes even if you are getting 50% of it, of whatever upside may be there in some transaction or some deal or something, eventually human psychology is such that no, I deserve more than 50%. What I'm getting is 50% is actually a loss of 30% because I am supposed to get 80%. And the same thing could be thought of as other side also. So that's why they say don't split the difference. I mean, so just doing 50-50 is a lazy way of negotiating or finding an outcome which theoretically seems perfect because you're sharing everything 50-50 losses or profits, but it's never workable because there is much more than simply cutting things in half, I mean, as such. So Fisher and Urey have these 4 steps, I mean, separate people from the problem, focus on interests, not positions, invent options for mutual gain, and insist on using of objective criteria. The last part is the one which I say it's very common sense oriented, in the sense you cannot fight. So if it is possible to have objective criteria of something, then it is best to use of them. To give you a very simple example, you have drugs and medical devices which need FDA approvals. There are 3 phases, 4 phases, whatever it may be, in different geographies. Now an objective criteria is which is usually an outsider controlled criteria, not something which is controlled by either of the parties, is that whatever new device or whatever new chemical that's come up should pass that particular milestone of being approved by FDA's particular phase, and only then like more investments outcomes can come into play. Now problem is that whenever this process, when objective criteria is split into multiple milestones, whether it's road construction with 4 phases, 5 phases, or building construction, shipbuilding, all kind of deals I've seen where although the criteria is objective, but if it is extended over a long period and you have multiple checkpoints or milestones, people may change their mind after getting more information after each milestone. A startup which is licensed a molecule may think, oh, I have actually sold out very easily, so let me wriggle out of the contract and get into a contract with somebody else. Happens all the time in land negotiation, that you've sold the land to somebody and some other person comes and says, I am ready to pay 50% more than what you have agreed for. So can you get out of the agreement? So happens all the time. So whenever the period between agreement to execution is long, the chances of one party changing their mind, that kind of risk will always be there as such. So let's see, I mean, how this is implemented, which I think is the most simple to understand and very common sense oriented method. So let's consider the situation that your company has ordered 10,000 units of raw material at 10 per unit, rupees 10 per unit from a supplier. S is the sole supplier of this material in India. S, after booking your order, decided to sell 10,000 units in stock. So this is different from the earlier example I had given, just to get started thinking. So here, after you have booked your order, that S decides to sell the 10,000 units in stock that could be supplied to you to some another customer who was ready to pay 15 rupees per unit. So you are mad at him and think of suing him. Before taking the noble step, you set up a meeting with S to negotiate. So the question is, how would you apply the principal negotiation framework? What would you do? Can we set up a poll? I mean, Mugdar, is it possible to do a poll or something?
You can ask them to reply on the chat.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
All right. So, what would you do in such a circumstance? I mean, if you can just put it in 3-4 sentences for this problem, that you ordered something, they've sold it to somebody else and made a extra 5 rupees profit per unit. Now, what would you do in a negotiation like this? I mean, what would you sue them to get, like what you lost, or how would it play out? I mean, so here there are two things. One is accounting for profits, as we say in contract law, that you may not have made a loss by not getting it for 10 rupees at this. You may have been able to get it at 10 rupees from somebody else, but the other side which had promised you has made 5 rupees profit. So that would be accounting for profits. The second thing is, let's say you had to buy it for 20 rupees from the market. So you actually made 20 rupees per piece as your loss. So those are, like damages that those are known as, like reliance damages or replacement damages, that to replace that thing from some other source, you had to incur a loss. And the other party may have made a profit or may not have made a profit, but they just didn't supply it to you. So in these circumstances, what would you do? So I have a few answers coming in. So one answer is Dr. Sonali Rao says, we'll ask them to supply the material in lower price as soon as possible. So that's an approach. So if your need still exists, I mean, if the time has not gone, you would say that supply it to me at a discount. I mean, maybe 5 rupees or maybe something like that, because you have made a profit at my expense. Then some Vaibhav says that I'll ask him to give it 7.5. So 7.5 is actually splitting the difference, that he's made, like 5 rupees per unit as the profit. So why don't you keep 2.5 rupees as profit and also give me a discount of 2.5? So sometimes it works. I mean, sometimes this is the best outcome of it. But whether it's sustainable, whether you would trust that person again because they, they broke their agreement, I mean, and whether that 2.5 will satiate you, that 2.5 will not work if you had to purchase it for 20 rupees from the market. So that at that stage, that in that situation, you will say you will have to be compensated fully, not only for the loss, but something more maybe. So one person says that 8 rupees per unit. So it's very similar to 7.5, but it's slightly 50 paisa more, I mean, for like the inconvenience maybe. Then Lakshmi Tulsi says that first understand if they're supplying to other at 15 has any impact on us. Now, would you, like, let's say if no loss has been caused to you, would you still be okay that they've supplied it to somebody else and not to you, and they've breached the contract? Lot of circumstances, if no loss is caused to you, people let this go away. And that's why negotiations are critical, that they don't have any defined path. I mean, you may give up because your need was not urgent. Let's say you wanted them to be supplied in 3 months. So that party can say, I can still supply you at the same point by the time the 3 months time period is over. So why are you worrying? Although I had sourced it for you, but I got a more profit, so I've sold it to somebody else. But I'll get you the same thing at same cost, I mean, which was agreed upon within the 3 months period that we have agreed upon. So at that time, as Lakshmi says, I mean, all right. So Harish Chandrasekhar says that compensated for the loss of time as well as breach of contract. So a lot of contracts, and this is just generally to keep in mind about contracts. So contracts have two categories related to time. One is whether the time is of essence. So whether it is time sensitive, the technical term which the lawyers use it, whether it's time of essence, whether time is of essence. So in a lot of like say perishable commodities and like back to back contracts, let's say you were an event organizer and you asked like some vehicles on rent. Now let's say the other side didn't supply. Now in that situation it's not possible to just forgive that person or say that next time you do it on time, because you that person had committed to you and you further had committed to somebody else. The back to back contracts are so common in the commercial world that A promises to B and B promises to C. Now if A breaches promises to B, it is likely that B will have to breach their promise to C if it is a major component of B's promise to C. So like the mathematical rule, A is greater than B, B is greater than C, it sort of commutates. I mean, the breach of contracts, like follows as a domino effect. I mean, so in those circumstances, you won't like be okay with, like the losses, I mean, as such. So one person says that Shardul says compensate the loss and ask for exclusiveness is possible. So that's all the interesting part of the creative side of generating options, as we'll see next, is that you essentially says that give me some more additional advantage, maybe monetary, maybe non-monetary in future. Now a lot of people don't want to do that. I mean, if you are thinking of breaking the relationship, then you don't want that exclusiveness because you cannot quantify it. And what value is it at against your loss or your potential losses, you don't know. I mean, so complex situations, usually what seems like a very simple buy and sell decisions usually leads to complex negotiations and whatever your circumstances are, and within that what's the best outcome you want. Then Saurav Padi says that if they're willing to supply the same product at the same price within the same established time frame, then there is no need for litigation. Obviously, all the negotiations of all kinds of all varieties that we are discussing here essentially is to come with a solution which does not lead us to litigation. So it is something through negotiation you can work out something, so it does not lead to break of relationships if that is the desired outcome, and also no litigation, and people get what they are looking for. So then Lakshmi says, I'll start with an open-ended negotiation. That's typically what you would start with. That the side which is wronged, I mean, is asked to put across a proposal that, look, this is what has happened. What do you propose? Some side will say, very hard negotiators, we simply are asking you to get lost. We don't intend to pay you anything. Possible. Why not? I mean, a lot of time people discover that time they don't have a written contract in such situations. So the other side there has a major advantage in bargaining power, that you don't have anything in writing. What are you going to sue me for? I mean, so all those factors come into play, and that's where like having a method for negotiation matters. I mean, let's look at a few entrepreneurial negotiations. I would like to have some time for Q&A. So you have investor negotiations, you have co-founder negotiations, initial customer negotiations, and resource allocation. So these are almost set patterns of negotiations you would come across in the startup or entrepreneurial world or early stage business world. So here, if you essentially, separate like interests from, so the first step of that getting to yes framework is separate people from the problem. So how do you separate people from the problem in investor negotiation? So investors have varied interest in investing in a company. They may not be simply for profit. I mean, they may want control of the company in future for strategic reasons. Then investors behind them want that company to be bought in future, or any kinds of, like ideas that they may have. I mean, so I mean, we have seen how in Flipkart situation, like although SoftBank had invested in multiple people like Myntra and Flipkart, all were into retail, but ultimately their strategies was consolidation. So Myntra was bought by Flipkart and all that kind of stuff. So you don't know what the investors are motivations are. So it may not only be profit, but their in Flipkart Myntra situation, it was essentially that we should have a large presence. I mean, in the market. I mean, so control and strategy are always core issues. Who will control the company? So it's in public that Ola's Bhavesh Agrawal essentially bought back, and also Ritesh Agrawal of Oyo Rooms, both bought back a large quantity of shares which they had given away to investors in different rounds, only to keep control of the company in a better way and also guide the strategy. So he's doing a big pivot, for example, into electric scooters, which may not have been investors' priority, but that's his priority. And he owns a substantial share in the company, so can direct the company in that direction. So control of the company and future strategy of the company are always the core issues in this negotiation. So you need to separate the people from the problem by saying that by trying to fathom or understand or grasp, I mean, that what is at stake here based on the circumstances and information you have. Is it not because this investor, but will any other investor also uh, coming in? If we don't reject this investor, will other investor also look at similar issues? Is it like a very key monopoly product, I mean, future that they are looking after most? For example, drug discoveries of this kind, that people are looking at exclusive monopolistic access to the market and dominate others and be early in the game for certain things. So there it's purely about control and strategy. And hence you saw, like smaller biotech companies like BioNTech and others essentially had to ally with the larger manufacturers, larger players in the ecosystem to essentially, gain a large share of the market and early large share of the market. A lot of time these investors and entrepreneurs have similar and other different. Sometimes the interest would converge, because so all the early sort of B2C investments that have happened in India and what are today known as unicorns are such where investors and entrepreneurs thought in a similar way that this is a completely unexplored market. Anybody who has a first mover advantage will create a moat around themselves that others would find very hard to breach, because most of these B2C businesses have a time span of running losses for a large number of years, and others may not be able to sustain such a loss leader kind of strategy. But it's not just in startup world. For example, in life insurance world, it took 7 years for the first private life insurance company, Bajaj Allianz, to actually make any profit. 7 years they just kept giving claims, and that's pretty much normal in life insurance business, because your premiums don't exceed the outgoes in that particular time. So there, if you're an investor in such a business, you are pretty much presumed that it will make losses for a long time. I mean, so that's how but we try to separate people from the problem, that not this investor, that investor, but what actually is the strategy which the other side has in mind, and what are their likely goals, I mean, out of it. You can ask some of them will tell you there is nothing hidden. I mean, Masayoshi Son tells people that I'm here to dominate a particular segment of the market. So be it. I mean, that sometimes it will be quite open. Sometimes it will have to be figured out. I mean, then the thing is to focus on interests and not positions. That what is the interest of the other side, not what the position they have taken. From product strategy to all other aspects, sticking to position that are pre-investment doesn't work. So whatever position you had before investments happened, that thing to like remain the same over time is very hard. So you would have seen Byju started with essentially validation of ideas, that can we have education online? I mean, and once the ideas was validated, both the, I mean, the investors and the, like the entrepreneur who started, both have a very common interest to keep buying companies from outside and expand and become as big as possible, whether it was Whitehead acquisition or something they acquired in Singapore. Nor, and from school education, they are into now, like supplementary professional education, all kind of thing they are expanding into. So whatever was their strategy at the time of investment was simply to validate this idea and see where it goes. Now it's completely shifted. So you can't have the same positional, posturing that this is what you told us at investment. Now you are changing your position. Well, it is bound to change. It's very natural. I mean, so, and what happens is each time somebody changes a position due to time or circumstances or change of priorities, you essentially, it throws up a new set of factors to consider in negotiations. So when these guys wanted more stake in their companies because they saw that when investors had a dominant stake and they were quick to exit from the company. So both Oya and Oyo Room guy and the Ola Room guy, they said, we don't want to give up the company so easily because of your funds requirement to give returns to your, investors over a certain period of time. All right. They got in some Japanese banks and others to bankroll that kind of transaction to buy back the shares. Why not? So that's the point, is to not focus on interests, to focus on interests, sorry, and not the positions which they have taken the party. So once you separate person from the, like the problem, once you separate, like interest from the position, what is their long-term interest or mid-term interest at least, in which needs to be taken. And it is very surprising to note, over experience I can tell you, that people have taken a posture which is actually damaging to them in the longer term, I mean, and in the midterm also. But they have taken it because they see short-term benefit to it. So they see a short-term benefit to breach the contract, but longer term, it would be damaging to them, is forgotten. So that's very like, very seat of the pants kind of, business style, where, or hostage kind of business style, where nothing, you're not thinking of long term at all and only thinking of short term, like profits to be made. So land market is like that. All land transactions, are extremely short term. Whether you'll make profits in the long term, everybody makes profits in the long term in land. So that's not considered of importance. What is considered of importance is to make short-term profits. So, I mean, that's how, it works out. I mean, but usually, I mean, a lot of people, when shown with data or with convincing arguments that it is in long-term interest to do something of this kind, people do come around, because companies in particular, larger companies, they want to exist beyond the founder's lifetime. That's the idea, that the company would last way longer than just the founder's presence in the company or the lifetime of the founders, I mean. So those companies and investors of those companies do want to like think beyond, like very short term. That's kind of the second prong of it. The third is, invent options for mutual gain. So what we saw was essentially in the small problem that we saw regarding, just buying supply of parts, I mean, at certain price, and that person selling it to somebody else. What was put into chat box and I read out were essentially like inventing of options for mutual gain. Lot of situations are there where you can have win-win options being generated. A win-win may be a short-term win for one side, a longer-term win for the other side, or vice versa, or mid-term gains for both the sides, or something of that kind, or may not be gains of not monetary kind, but non-monetary gains on one side and monetary gains on one side, or all the permutations, combinations you can think of those things. So it's possible to invent options for mutual gain, but there are situations where it's not possible also. I should be like clear about it. And as I said, gains may not be simultaneous. It may not be instantly that each side recovers their gain instantly. but then it's, like the staying capacity and somebody willing to forego short-term gains for longer-term gains. I mean, uh, yeah, one side wants royalty, other side wants to, like use the IP for a long time. Fine. I mean, you want like uh, instant royalty because you want to have some other priorities or need of cash. I mean, so all right. I mean, that can work out well also. So just as an example, like investor asks you to okay, I think they've been admitted. All right. So investor asks you like to sell a product technology for lump sum to a competitor while you're thinking of licensing it for better options. One of the most common patterns, I mean, or tropes of licensing negotiations around IP is that should you go for an exclusive deal or a non-exclusive deal? Non-exclusive always sounds interesting, that you'll have more options to license it to more people, but an exclusive deal also may make sense. I mean, a lot of factors go on to decide what is the best sort of outcome in a particular licensing situation. Now, insist on using objective criteria. So one of the most common objective criteria used by whether it's investors or whether it's business people is the discounted cash flow method. Now, it seems like a very analytical method, but the magic number here is the discount rate. I mean, the risk rate that is put on the investment. Now, that is a number pulled out of hat. You can say it is more than, the savings bank's interest rate and all that, but that is usually a number pulled out of the hat. I mean, so the risk factor is quantified, but it's not perfectly quantified. So discounted cash flow can be misleading in many ways. Plus, how will market play out? And people have this, like forward estimates of 5 years, 10 years. Nobody really can see beyond 3 years how the markets would function or this thing. People who can focus that, I mean, take aviation. Who would have expected, Corona to hit and aviation market to take such a hit? Plus, lots of regulatory things keep happening which nobody can predict that when they will arrive and in what form they will arrive. So sometimes it's very hard, but if there are objective criteria in industry, some standards are there, some uh, you know uh, established conventions are there, how to value things, how to measure things, what sort of measures to take. So in our simple example of supply, it could be that it's very common in that industry to replace it and give a certain discount. So if that is there, then let's use that objective criteria to settle it. So it doesn't matter whether I give you something more or less. And I can tell you one particular line of business where there are lots of convention, it works very well for them is shipping. So international shipping works on a lot of conventions and practices which they have developed over time of how the risk will be shifted and to whom and when in what circumstances, and it works well for them. And so they have converted, what were conventions or practices into essentially rules of international trade. I mean, so discounted cash flow may not be always be the objective criteria. There are other kinds of objective criteria also. I mean, so that's all want to create, but insisting on an objective criteria leads to better outcomes, no doubt about it. There are always other issues like multiple investors clash. If there are two investors, they may not have the same goals. I mean, and the investee is actually at loss about whom to follow and which strategy follow, because there are two people at loggerheads about what to do with this investment. Multi-party negotiations, tactics versus strategy in negotiations. Lots of people think that strategy has very little place in negotiation. It's always tactics, like, so those are guerrilla tactics, or very common in positional bargaining, is essentially linked to use of tactics. I mean, and there are lots of books and websites about all the tactics you can use. So one common tactic is the salami tactic. So salami tactic is essentially salami. It's the kind of a meat, I mean, where you essentially make thin slices, circular slices of this thing and put on pizzas or something. So is to grant concessions or take concessions in a very thin like steps. I mean, small steps. I mean, as such, but then over time they amount to so much that you have actually taken way more than that any other person would have given it to you on in any negotiation. But there always comes a time when people think it's not worth keeping the contract. Let's like refuse to perform our side of the contract if it is goes into zone of making very big losses. I mean, so people say, damn it, I mean, I'll not do it further. All right, so tech deals are in some of you, because this is the program is around I presume a lot of science tech background guys would be there. So that's why I added a few slides for this. It's a hybrid aggregate. So one thing is to understand that tech is not one thing. I mean, people think that you got a patent on it and all that you need to decide is how to monetize the patent. So it's not one thing. It is a bunch of things together. So it's not easy to slice and dissect it to monetize it very easily. To give geographical licenses, time control licenses, or technology control license that will give license it for one version but not the another. All, I mean, not very easy to structure those agreements, but it essentially needs a lot of open-ended, lot of deep thought out conversations with the other side and understanding motivations, plans of each side to come up with a licensing model which is fair to begin with and sustains over time. So that's always the challenge with technology licensing, because it's not a fixed thing. I mean, as one particular X or Y is not a physical thing. Its intangible nature actually makes it very difficult to deal with in license. So it's easy to say that non-exclusive license retain maximum value for the technology owner, but it's not easy to execute, because what if you issued only one non-exclusive license and nothing to, let's say you were in a technology negotiation with somebody and you said, I want to give it for $1 million if it's non-exclusive, but if it is exclusive, I want $5 million. The other side says, all right, we'll take non-exclusive. We don't mind competition in the market because we know how we can make profit out of it and beat any competition. So they'll say, we'll go with the non-exclusive. But what if later on you find that there is nobody else ready to, take another non-exclusive license? So what seemed like you will give 20 non-exclusive licenses ended up with just one license. So the non-exclusive in reality is an exclusive license because there are no other takers for it. So non-exclusive does not always mean retaining maximum value for it. Again, very fact specific to find out what will be the optimum outcome of it. It is not an academic problem. It is deeply linked to market knowledge and relationships with potential customers. So a lot of people think we really know, like the science in and out of this or the tech in and out of this, but what market knowledge and like potential customers, how whole thing would play out, I think it needs other inputs. I mean, and not just inputs of the tech people. I mean, and that's why business is a combination. Large companies have combination of business people, finance people, sales people when they're making a major investment decision, because it's not just tech which is important, it's the other side of it. To give you a common example, lots of artificial intelligence startups are coming up. Nobody really knows what is the potential of that market, how it will play out. So IBM had a major product for artificial intelligence called Watson. So there was, about a month ago, there was a long deep dive article in New York Times about how IBM has literally folded up Watson as a AI engine. So the idea was that different applications would subscribe to it for its AI processing power and get outputs as such. But it seems that it hasn't played out at all as they had expected. So like something like artificial intelligence, where we don't know how things are to be played out, I think you have only limited visibility into what would be the most optimum kind of licensing to do in those circumstances. So the slicing and dicing, as I said, of technology is again very hard for emerging technologies. It's very easy for well-established consumer-oriented products which have had. So if today Parle-G were to give out licenses to somebody else to make it, as a very solid data of so many years of the geographies about where and who can make it. Parle also, I mean, if you pick up any Parle-G, you will see 4 or 5 licensed manufacturers of Parle-G region-wise. So they've already licensed manufacturing to a number of manufacturers. So they obviously did it knowing that, what their sales are going to be, what like other things are going to be. I'm not involved in it, but it's public knowledge. But they actually cancelled one of the such manufacturing licensing because the sales numbers didn't match or something happened on the quality side. I don't know exactly what happened, but these things can go wrong. I mean, quite easy. Control is a very less understood thing, that whether it's human beings or whether it's businesses, we do exert power through control. I mean, and it's easy to lose control of technology by a bad licensing deal. Policing or audit clauses are very hard to implement. It's very easy to say every year you'll give me returns of what you have made under this particular product. Either sometimes the records would not be kept or the reports would not be shared. So what you thought would be multi-year revenues turns out that only first year something was paid and then nothing was paid later on. Academic and government institutions may not want to give up control, but sometimes it's counterproductive because they didn't give up control early on. They stuck to it thinking that there is a big potential future for it. But they didn't want to give up control. So in some cases, they've given up control and lost monies in future. So very tricky situation, or they didn't make it as much as they thought. I mean, particularly this University of Wisconsin kind of biotech licensing. Uh, they could have made much more money out of that program. I mean, but essentially they have figured out that you can only make so much money out of tech. I mean, if you're just a pioneer and you're not doing the rest of the value chain. My personal preference is for lump sum deals, particularly in early stage technologies where things are very unknown. And the company, which is the licensor, is also struggling to see their business run. But have had bad stories while doing this strategy, because it's only later on somebody else made money over it. But you have to live with these things. I mean, take decisions and live with it. I mean, once the deal's end is there, deal is dead. It's very hard to control. You can't say, give me back all my technology, and you just forget that what you learned by using my technology. I mean, so those are not easy. I mean, technology can't be returned once it's shared. I mean, although you may say that I have returned all the papers and all the drawings and designs and formulas, but it stays in human minds. So it's not that easy. I mean, post licensing developments are one of the most tricky areas of licensing. How to control ownership of modifications, and all this I'm telling that all this needs to be negotiated upfront. I mean, while you are doing the deal, because once the contract licensing deal is signed, people are very reluctant to change things. I mean, or sign, like addendums or modifications of those agreements, because they have set up the rest of the plans based on what is written in the agreement. So those are tricky areas to be negotiated, but have to be kept in mind. Academic research licensing has its own challenges in India, particularly, and Dr. Premnath will be able to tell you more about it. I have very little experience in that area. I mean, but those are hard deals to structure. That's what I've seen. I mean, in my little experience. And productization and other things. I mean, in such circumstances, is a very far away kind of this thing. And you would have seen in the COVID vaccines that came out of India and all that. So there was a lot of this discussion in the IP community and also in press about that, whether ICMR controls some of the technology or not, what work they did and what were the licensing terms on it, whether they gave the data or they gave some like only the genome mapping or they gave something else. Nothing ultimately came out of it, but there was a lot of debate about these things. So that's the challenge of academic licensing, because some people who were on this thing that it's public funded in invention. So why should like anybody make why should it be charged so high, or like they should pay back to the government and all that kind of we just saw debates. Nothing came out of it. I mean, uh, having a contract license is a start. Enforcing contracts is very expensive, although you may have a contract. So in negotiations, it needs to be understood that although you have a contract, but enforcing it is quite expensive. It's not that trivial. A contract which is of few lakh rupees, I would not advise anybody to file litigation on it, because if it's just couple of lakhs, I mean, with legal fees and all the process and all that, it may not be worthwhile for you at all to litigate. I mean, so that's how it is. So terminating, like licenses should be done very thoughtfully, because there are consequences for it. And international negotiations have their own costs and challenges, particularly dispute resolution. This is a case study if you want to think through or need material to think through on very similar lines, that X as a company had developed a device to monitor health parameters. The device had to be inserted surgically in the body. The device is regulated by FDA. No human trials have taken place as yet taken place for the device as yet, but some preliminary like validation has been done in the lab as such. It includes both hardware and software, but it cannot work without either of those. So then there's a Y company, which is a large company in the field of medical devices. It wishes to license X company's device for a royalty of just 100,000 per year for both hardware and software. And Y company can actually develop the software for X company's devices through its internal team, but its priority is to get both hardware and software as a package license if possible. So already you see there is an asymmetry between the interests. That so if you separate the people from the interest, what will happen here? You can see that whether it's X or Y. So interest on one side is to pay lowest royalty on Y side, and if possible get hardware and software for both that cost. But even if you had to pay a little more, I mean, maybe it may be okay. But so that's the zone of possible agreement. But if not possible, then let's just buy the hardware and let's just develop our own software for it. I mean, while excess priority is to get $1 million for both hardware and software. I think okay, I put it here. Yeah, so X company's CEO flies down to Y company's headquarters. X offers a license for its device to Y company at a price of $1 million per year for hardware and software, along with future updates for 5 years. So X is actually offering something which Y has not had in mind, which is like 5 years of future updates to both hardware and software. But they are asking for a price which is way outside what they had planned for, that we want current versions hardware and software. So Y company only wishes to offer 100,000 per year as a one-time licensing fee, and if possible wants further updates. So while you're starting off negotiations, why would you want to not want it at the cost which you want it? I mean, let's start negotiating from there. So how would you negotiate it here? So wanted it to be sort of take home, that you could think of these factors, I mean, both the sides, and think through whether analytically it's possible to model it using whatever tools you have, even simple Excel to, like some other software or something, and or statistically put weights to any decision making tree or forecasting model. And it's possible to forecast something like this. And it will tell you that the behavioral model perhaps has a slight edge in these circumstances, but it's possible to do some analytical work also on it. So from X's company's side, what was the thinking going on in X's team? So one is, like it needs to explain why it's asking for $1 million royalty. So here right away you separate, people from the positions, and also eliminate the posturing. Is you can ask for $1 million royalty, but what is your justification for it? So what you could offer as, like more quantifiable basis for your demand is you tell them that there are others who are ready to offer something like this. If there are no confidentiality issues around it, you can say the market size current and expected according to us is this much. The other side may dispute it, but you are providing justification for it, you are providing evidence for it. And then you have market studies to show that something similar is valued in this way. So valuation is not just for companies and those financial investments. It's also for like offers which are being made in negotiations. So if you're asking for $1 million as royalty, you need to back it up with something. that why we are asking for $1 million royalty. Not just that because we want it to be 1 million. You are in the market and it's a bargain going on. So you'll have to justify why your demand is such. The concessions which X could make was instead of flat $1 million, it could offer a scaled revenue model. So right away, we don't want $1 million, but for 5 years future updates, if things go well and market develops, and essentially what happens is if the whole thing is spread over 5 years, and let's say the total comes to $5 million, $1 million for each year, but you get 5 years of updates and the upfront is not much more, but it is the risk is shared over time on an increasing curve, and towards the fifth year, like it's there. The other side would want such that most of the bulk of the revenue of such a deal would be towards the end, while the party which is licensor, would want it that most of it is upfront. So this tug of war will go on, and this is essentially finding an optimized risk sharing pattern. And that's what the negotiations would involve. It could offer revenue sharing, it could offer co-branding or white labeling in the return for less amount of royalties so that it could sell it to other parties, as white label goods. All these is, so concessions are concessions to the other side, but they are essentially generating options for mutual gain. And based on some objective criteria like market numbers or something measurable, And then from Y company's side, it would be that Y company wants it at 100,000 royalty. So they are trying to reduce the royalty. Other side is trying to increase the royalty, and the delta is quite high of $900,000. It says it doesn't need software because it has, in-house capability to develop it. It can present its own market sizing data where they don't see that as a market which will rise in 5 years. It could be a market which would rise in say 10 or 15 years, who knows. So yeah, or they could say there are lots of risks involved in terms of getting an FDA license to it. It could also tell you that so objectively what data can be provided is that the cost of setting a separate manufacturing line for these products is so and so. So if we buy it for 100,000, only then the cost of manufacturing line can be amortized over a short time of period, else our calculations would go haywire. So this is like partial open ended fair communication, because you are telling numbers which you think are believable by the other side also, that this is the cost for manufacturing, who will pay for it. So, and this problem was seen right now in the last 1 year when government and the manufacturers of COVID vaccine were wrangling with each other. So 150 rupees cost for the initial vaccine doses was agreed to because the risk was on the regulatory side. Government said, what if, like some of this needs to be stopped or it fails or whatever. And across the world, this was done. But in the later round, the manufacturer simply refused that we can't sell it at 150. So because the risk pattern is now known. So we'll change it. We want more money out of it. And somewhere it was agreed to whatever 250 or, like little more for Covaxin, etc. But that's sort of the problem we do. And the main thing which the manufacturers were telling, and without the specifics, was that who will pay for setting up this manufacturing line? Because if you give us an advance for only the order to be manufactured, you are simply paying in advance for the product, but you are not funding, like the manufacturing of it. And later on, they got the grants or something of it. But essentially, we fell back on manufacturing because nothing was invested in manufacturing. It was supposed that private players would invest in it, which is usually the public procurement, this thing that we won't give your setup cost because that is your business, ultimately. So because ultimately you will use it for some other purpose, once our order is done, we are not concerned what you do with it. So, but that cost is there, and it's required in a short period, particularly for the scaled supply timings and the milestones that were linked to it. But so these are the negotiations which keep happening in any similar situation. That was an example. So the concessions that Y could offer were, what if increase in royalty is there if source code is included? What if they are able to give us the source code? Maybe we can create it right from scratch. But if we increase the royalty and if we get the source code, our cost of developing it from scratch goes down. Plus somebody has validated it. So if we have source code, then like it could be a better outcome for us, even paying a little more for it. I mean, so may not be 1 million, but let's say $200-300 million more. And again, if that concession is given, the other side's negotiating parameters and model changes completely. That let's say if they were offered $500,000, not the 1 million that they are expecting, but $500,000. Again, they'll start thinking that whether it's worth stepping down 500 or is it not, I mean, for us, or are there other counter proposals to be given of other kinds of offers. Increase in royalty is linked to FDA approvals and milestones. That's a concession which you could give, that will give you 1 million, but it will be linked to like all these approvals and all that. Because the downside risk of a failure of an FDA approval is that the whole thing is cost. If it is completely rejected by FDA, then the value of it is zero. So while it may seem that you are starting from 100,000 and you're paying for 1 million, but in a scenario, if the device is completely rejected, even your 100,000 goes down the drain, and also your investment for setting up the manufacturing plant. It could offer to invest in X as a financial investment and take stock and become part owners of the company. So any profits which X is making, ultimately indirectly are their profits, whether it in terms of increase in share or dividends or whatever that way. And this was what was done by when Apple went down as a company. Microsoft invested about $150 million into Apple, while they were simply making products for Apple platform like Word and Excel and PowerPoint, but they wanted them to be alive as in competition. So they invested in them, and that was one of the best investments they made, it said. So that's also possible. I mean, that will fund you in some way, because ultimately some of the profits would be rerouted to us in some or the other form as such. All right, that's all I had to say. I mean, if there are any questions, I can take.
Hasit.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is Premnath here. Just wanted to request you to talk. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. I wanted you to discuss a few more things, and I just wanted to set that up a little bit if you're okay, right?
Yeah. We have some 8-9 minutes, so whatever we can.
Okay. So one of the things is the dynamics of a negotiation and the team itself, right? What happens in the team? Okay. So sometimes, many of our scientists, entrepreneurs are in a great hurry to finish discussion very, very quickly, close negotiations and so on. Also, if they're speaking to a large company, okay, how does it work in terms of who should they present at the first point of the discussion? What should happen later? What is the role of the board? What is the role of the CEO? Do you want to comment on that? Because very often that there's a lot of confusion around that.
Very true. This is one of the big factors that you could be negotiating with the wrong person. That person may not have the authority to take decisions or even convey to the right levels. And a lot of time companies simply, when there are shallow inquiries or shallow interests of proposals, they simply depute, somebody at very low down the chain of authority and control. And whatever you tell them may not be even reaching the board in the form that you want. I mean, so authority to negotiate is a very big concern, and hence it becomes very important that you are accessing the right level of decision making. So if it's like a new molecule which could be $1 billion opportunity, if you're talking to the sales manager, it is absolutely not going anywhere. It would go into circles and go nowhere. So you should be talking to somebody, either head of the research, head of the marketing, or somebody who is in the committee on the board, or somebody holding the joint CEO, or somebody who knows, stuff, or what happens in most tech negotiations, that first level is always technical people, sort of filter out that yes, it is feasible, it is worthwhile talking further. So hence, even in all bidding situations for contracts and all that, the first bid which is put in is technical bid, and then financial bid. So if you don't cross the technical bid stage, then there is no point in seeing even your financial bid, because you are not confident enough.
Hasit, my point was also whether we should be presenting all decision makers in one shot or not.
No, I don't think so. That is very wise, because that's like that full and open like kind of strategy, that this is what one. So it conveys two things. One is, it probably conveys, if you have told everything that you expect from the deal, it probably conveys that you have a hard red line, that this is your final this thing, and that's why you're telling all levels the same thing, that this is what, take it or leave it. This is our terms. We don't change it for anybody else. Now, if you are in a monopoly position, yes, you can do that. But if you're not in a monopoly position, then, it's perhaps not a good idea to tell that this is our deal and we are telling it to all levels of people, and there is no time. And this is a very iterative give and take process. And as I said earlier, it seems most of the time nothing is happening. So it's not, I would not advise that, you go all in and say that this is what our terms are, and if you want to take it, leave it. Today, nobody in any tech industry in this position is in a position, because of the nature of maturity of technologies, that they can really dictate the terms to the market, that take it or leave it, because so much is happening so in so many places around the world. So how do you say that just take it or leave it?
Yeah. So Hasit, there's one other situation where say a entrepreneur is negotiating with a large company, and the large company says, bring all the key decision makers right now. We don't want to discuss it again. Okay. And and the CEO also, there's one more situation where the CEO is tempted to position themselves as the entire decision maker, and that has its own consequences in the negotiations, right? So you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah. So this is, see a large company negotiating with a small company. They may want that, please get all of particularly co-founders in the same meeting room, because we will, one person will agree with us, other person will disagree with us, because they are so, there is so much of ownership and personality involved into what they have done, that one person may then turn around and say, no, we don't want to do the deal, and whole deal would be derailed. So they do want, everybody in the room for that reason. And that may be okay if your strategy and everything is quite clear. And a small company telling a large company, no, first you meet our, who is the chief sales officer, and then you'll come to meet our CEO, is a little, like, in business terms, it doesn't work. I mean, if you are keen to sell, then you should be putting your best foot forward, because you are the salesperson, you are selling your stuff. I mean, so they expect somebody higher up in the chain. And that's why all the investment bank, everybody is a vice president. So because nobody wants to talk with somebody who is a nobody. So
yeah, but Hasit, there is this issue that sometimes for certain decisions, like an investment decision, a major, you have to go back to the board, right? So you cannot be pretending that you're going to take all the decisions.
With you.
Yeah, that's provided you don't have another board member.
Correct.
Right? Okay. So the one other point I just wanted, which is a practical use, which I wanted you to discuss also, is in when you're looking at agreements. When there's a stalemate, right? There are a few things. One is sometimes when you're negotiating, what is the role of the lawyer there? Okay. A CEO, lawyer on both sides, on either side. What is the role of the lawyer? And the second is also, what is it that how do you create this whole mechanism by which you go back and create options and come back for clauses. Okay.
Correct.
That is something which sometimes people get stuck on, because you have to be creative there. You have to be creative in creating options, right? For clauses. And many of our startups very often get stuck. They think that if somebody's insisting on a certain clause, they have no way out. So we often tell them that go back and ask what the intention is, and then figure out an alternative, right?
Correct. Yeah. So some of it is simply, as you mentioned, like you started with the role of lawyer. So the lawyers, I mean, you would based on like the person you are dealing with. Some of them may think that their role and your instructions to them are only to memorialize your agreement. So put it on paper, whatever you have agreed in, like nice, clear language or something like that in paragraphs and all that. So that's and put in the standard clauses. So like, you have like warranty clauses, you have indemnity clauses, you have, like typical like force majeure clauses, all that standard clauses you want the lawyer to put in. Now, you may have a little more inputs from the lawyer if, if you wish to, and if the other side has the mandate and interest to do it, is to give you that some perspective on how this would play out. Because having done agreements over long time, they do have insight into what worked and what didn't work as such. So a lot of agreements, you can look at them and think that it's unworkable over a certain period of time. I mean, because the interest would shift so much, the risks would shift so much that ultimately one party is going to, like walk away from this agreement. So they do have a larger role. But to the second part of your question, that like about the creativeness of the options and all that, there needs to be some common sense filter to those options generated. Because although they may look very creative and fancy and all that, the large companies, like have their own restrictions in the kind of deals that they would enter on. So for example, you offer, you pull out a creative option that why don't we give you equity instead of, like some upfront money, or like we can't invest in manufacturing, but we would like, like joint revenues from manufacturing, but instead of money, we are putting our startups equity into it. Now, large companies have certain restrictions. They can't, like take anything as equity. That may be in the startup world, it may be common to swap equities and, consider equities equivalent to cash. But large companies won't consider it as equivalent to cash. They'll say, we'll build a manufacturing plant jointly. You have to pony up the cash. I mean, you can't expect us to take equity because it's illiquid equity. What will we do with that equity? Who will, equipment suppliers are not going to like, that can't be banked upon to raise even loans. So those kind of options are not creative. They are like outliers. I mean, so common sense filters have to be put in what is workable as a creative option. I mean.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question on how has a negotiation table changed in the Corona times, physical meeting versus Zoom meetings?
Yeah, I mean, lots of, I mean, the whole deals which were done with RIL, I mean, with Google and Facebook and all investing, they were all done online. There was no travel because they happened in the very first month of lockdown. I'm sure there was preparatory stuff earlier and people may have met, but all the investors, all the like agreements, from what I know from the legal community, they were all done online. There was no difficulty in doing it online. And the transaction lawyers, they all say that this Zoom thing is fine. I mean, they have no problems about it.
Yeah. It's 7 o'clock. So we are done with the time. There are a couple of questions, but should we leave it for now and come back later, or you want to take
just quickly, there is a can a mediator work for startups in long term? I mean, mediation is essentially, you're working, whether you call a mediator as negotiator or negotiator and mediator won't matter as labels, because at that point of time in deal, mediators usually are seen as somebody who would solve disputes. I mean, but at that point when deals are being done, mediators are negotiators and negotiators are mediators. But as a third party involved, I mean, I don't know how other side views it. You will have to align with one side. You can't be a neutral third party in a deal. Very few situations would allow that because you have no skin in the game. So what does your opinion count? I mean, nothing as such. And then regarding X and Y example you gave, why lies about its current sales figures, downplay the figures and license was made at a lower cost. What could X do post licensing? Well, litigate, what else, or renegotiate the license. I mean, if they're willing to do that. If it was completely case of fraud, then what do you do? I mean, except for renegotiation or litigation.
You could possibly write your clauses in such a way that those are conditional on certain numbers, right?
Yeah,
They move along with
those are undertakings given. I mean, so you undertake that these numbers are reliable. So, I mean, just to give you a common example, they just last week I was reading a case. So, this ONGC guys entered into a contract to build a pipeline or something. So, they had given soil testing data. Now, the guy who actually did the work, they said, I found hard surface way early in my digging as compared to what the ONGC soil testing data said. So, but he was not able to enforce it because the tender terms said that we are giving you this soil testing data as a reference material, but you are free to do your own soil testing and you come up with, you know, whatever like your own conclusions are before you put in the bid. So that clause saved ONGC that, and it's come in the papers and all that. I mean, that you are on your own. I mean, there was no undertaking that at 3 feet you will find hard rock and all that. I mean,
yeah, Hasit, my point was that Y is under no obligation to reveal its current sales figures, right? Normally, if they're on the other side. And you could always write up the agreement in such a way that your terms are related to how well they do in sales.
Yes, I mean, and also see, sales for their existing products is a completely different animal. As soon as even a new product of the same kind which they're selling, let's say pacemakers or let's say some, you know, watches or something, the new model that is introduced may not have the same traction as the older one. And companies, their challenges are essentially around a clause which is known as a good faith effort clause. So will you promote your new product which you're licensing from us, making using our technology? Will you promote it even at the cost of cannibalizing your existing product line? And most companies don't do that. So that good faith efforts to push or market it are always a problem.
Great. I think we have covered all the questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Hasit. This was wonderful.
All
right. I think with that, we will stop here. Mukta, you should be, I think, putting out the feedback form, request everybody to put up their feedback. Also, Hasit, I'll now hand it over to Mukta and she can take over with the administrative announcements. Okay?
Thank you, Prima.
Thank you so much, Hasit. Thanks for coming up.
Always a pleasure to interact with Venture Center.
Thank you so much. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Hasit, for this session. Let us now move on to some announcements. You are all already aware about the pitch to investor session on 4th of September. I hope you have noted your timings, and also the instructions and template is sent over email. So please take a note of that. So I hope, except for IRO, none of you has sent a regret for not attending the session. So I'm assuming most of you are attending. Please tell us in advance if you're not going to avail of your slot so that we don't take up time from the investors. Another announcement is about the 3rd September session. We are giving time, prep time for pitch decks will be given. So please use the 3rd September time slot for preparing your pitch decks for 4th September, which is the investor pitch decks day. We are planning an additional session on 8th of September between 5 to 7 p.m. Dr. Premnath has already given a heads up about this. It is on Networking 101 for Startup Founders by Dr. Shailendra Vyakarnam. So this is planned for 8th of September and requesting all of you to mark your calendars for the same. Another heads up is about an event being planned with eminent invitees from PSA, Niti Aayog, AIM team and CSIR and other eminent invitees. And this is going to be a launch event for Playbook and the library portals. Also, it will be a progress peek into what has happened up till now in the AIM Prime program. So this is planned for 20th of September, 12 noon to 1 p.m. So again, requesting every one of you to please mark your calendars and be available on this date also. We are still to receive comments and feedback from all of you on the playbook. So please use the link which was given by Anmol in one of the emails and requesting you to give your feedback on the playbook, the sections which are already open. Of course, the feedback link is in the chat box. Please fill that up. And we will meet you all on 1st of September for the last session in this talks from the AIM Prime program. And that is going to be case studies on the nuances of scaling technology startups. And we have an eminent panel who's going to be moderated by Dr. Satyadesh and Dr. Premnath. So meet you all on 1st of September at 5 o'clock. That's all for today. Good.